Hello, everyone, and welcome to our celebration of the 57th anniversary of the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. I want to welcome our panelists. We have three amazing women. One of them is going to be joining us shortly, all of which have contributed to the Women in Space movement. And so I'm going to take a moment and introduce our panelists by reading their amazing bios. Now, this is just a small snippet of the cool things that they've done. And so I'm going to read it. And I don't read very well. So we're going to start with you, Tanya. Dr. Tanya Harrison is a professional Martian, having spent the last decade working in mission operations for NASA's Mars orbiters and rovers. She holds a PhD in geology with a specialization in planetary science and exploration from the University of Western Ontario. She has a master's in earth and environmental science from Wesleyan University and a bachelor's in physics and astronomy from the University of Washington. Currently, she is the manager of science programs at the federal arm of Planet Labs. Tanya is also an avid science communicator, having made appearances on TV, radio, and podcasts around the world. You can find her prolifically tweeting on space, Mars, and inclusion in STEM on Twitter at Tanya of Mars. Welcome, Tanya.
Thanks for having me.
And now we have Dr. Ulyana Horodyskyj. She dreams of going to space and has since a very young age. She was one of 120 semifinalists for the 2007 NASA astronaut selection class. And in September to October of 2016, she was chosen as mission commander for the NASA Johnson Space Center's HERA 12 mission, which is Human Exploration Research Analog. It was a 30-day isolation experiment simulating a long-duration mission to an asteroid. In addition to space, Ulyana's totally infatuation with nature started young at the age of 6 when she saw for the first time the Swiss Alps and was hooked. By the time she turned 23, Ulyana had traveled to and worked on all 7 continents. She is the founder and CEO of Science in the Wild, an international STEM education and adventure company that specializes in getting people, kids, adults, and teachers out on extraordinary field experiences around the world, as well as virtually. She can be found at Science in the Wild on Instagram. Hi, Uli. Welcome.
Hello. My shirt says it all. Glad to be
here. And then our third panelist, I'm going to read her bio and hopefully she'll be popping in soon. That's going to be Dr. Shauna Pandya. She is a scientist astronaut candidate with Project Possum, a physician, aquanaut, speaker, martial artist, advanced diver, skydiver, pilot in training, VP of immersive medicine with Lusonic Technologies, and a fellow of the Explorers Club. She is also director of the Possum Space Medicine Group and chief instructor of the Possum Operational Space Medicine Group. She holds degrees in neuroscience, space studies, entrepreneurship, and medicine. She is currently completing a fellowship in wilderness medicine. Her research interests center on resilience in extreme environments and reproduction in long-duration spaceflight. Now that's interesting. In 2019, Dr. Pandya served as crew health and safety officer during the private 5-day underwater Neptune, which stands for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration, mission at the Jules Underwater Lodge. Neptune studied changes in psychology, physiology, and cognition related to living and working in saturation. Dr. Pandya has also completed 2 rotations at the Mars Desert Research Station, most recently in January 2020 as the commander. So thank you for joining us. And those of you out in cyberspace, thank you also for joining us in this discussion today. And so one of the things reason why I brought these amazing women together is to celebrate women in space, but also to talk about the past, the present, and the future of women in space. And so Valentina became the first female in space very early in human spaceflight history. I mean, we're talking 1963. And so very early. Yet women in general, along with people of color, LGBTQ, and non-binary, have had a history of not being included. From your perspective, what challenges and opportunities have you or women in general faced in space exploration? So thinking from a historical perspective, how has your career evolved, or the things that you've seen with women through the history in space? I'm going to start with you, Tanya.
I've definitely seen a shift over time. I've been doing this for almost 15 years now, which feels really weird to say. And I can remember being in physics classes as an undergraduate, especially the higher level physics classes, where I was the only female student in the entire class, and going to conferences where you hardly saw any women at all. And now going to conferences, there's definitely a huge split between, the whole older community tends to be men, but you see a ton of women, you see a ton of people of color. It's still not great, ratios like overall, but you can see that the wave is changing, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, I feel the same way, that every time I go, there is just more inclusion, which really makes me excited about the future. Uli, how about you?
I absolutely agree with that. I've definitely also seen a shift. So I was born in the mid 80s, and I was really into science as a kid. I grew up with two older brothers, so they were always encouraging me, and we were always like just experimenting with things randomly in the kitchen, much to mother's dismay. But I did a lot of science fairs and symposia. It was a way for me to really get exposed to science experimentation, and to meet people from around the world, men and women from all over. And I definitely was always the one woman really in my category. To give you an example, so I was 14 and I entered this national symposium, and I presented a project on solar sails. So at that point, it was still theory. It's like, can we use the pressure of sunlight to move these spacecraft to places like Mars and beyond? So that was my research. I had an amazing mentor, Dr. Robert Forward, who assisted me with that. And I remember at JPL, I got invited to give a talk, a 14-year-old kid, right? And in front of all these rocket scientists, mostly a room full of men. And then also in my category at this symposium, I actually got a comment that said, "Oh, little girl, are you lost?" Because I was with all these older people in my category and all male, and I ended up winning the category. And so it was definitely this shift that I've been seeing since those early days, in the science fair symposia world, to then majoring in, I switched over to planetary sciences and earth sciences from astronomy, and then into graduate school and now teaching, definitely seeing a lot more women. So it's really encouraging, and it's just neat to see, but we still have a ways to go.
It's interesting to hear our own personal stories of being the only person and the perception when you walk into the room. Those of you guys that are here, yes, please leave a comment. And if you have a question, drop it into the chat and we'll bring that up. Are males in space, or male astronauts and cosmonauts like Yuri Gagarin, Alan Shepard, and John Glenn, they're better known and celebrated than their female counterparts to some extent. Like, a lot of people didn't even know of Valentina Tereshkova or when Sally Ride went up into space. Is there something to be said about being first, regardless of gender? What do you think about the whole, who gets to be first in history, and what does that mean if you're a female?
I mean, that certainly stands out, right? We remember Neil Armstrong as the first man that walked on the moon. And at least in our community, we probably remember Yuri Gagarin as the first man in space. And once you move away from those, it starts to feel less significant maybe to people that are outside of the highly specialized area of caring about space. I know, for example, I've talked to a lot of people that are not American who have never heard of Sally Ride because she was not something significant to them as the first American woman in space. And I mean, it was so much longer between when Russia sent Valentina and when America finally sent Sally Ride. There's 20 years there between that gap. So it would be amazing if we had something where it wasn't the classifier of the first woman to do this thing. It's the first person to do this thing who happened to be a woman. And that's when it will become most memorable, I think.
And so, thinking about that and the going to the moon and Mars, I think, will be definitely going back to the moon is significant, but Mars is going to be even more significant to some extent. Uli, do you have any comment on what we were just talking about with if being first? How does that matter to some extent?
So I was thinking about this actually from the perspective, because I'm also a mountaineer. I absolutely love being in the mountains. And so thinking about Everest, right? The first people on Everest, who was it? Sir Edmund Hillary, right? And Tenzing Norgay Sherpa. Neither one ever said who was first. I loved that. They're like, we did it together. Even if someone was ahead of the other, they just said we did it together. And so when thinking about moon and then obviously out to Mars, I would love to see that. That's one small step for humankind.
Yeah, exactly. But we still put a lot of emphasis on who is, a lot of emphasis on gender and who is the first. And there's a lot of chatter right now about who will be the first female on the moon. And, we know that person is alive, and we know that the person who is going to be the first human on Mars is probably alive. And so it's interesting how we label things in our society. And do you think that we'll eventually be able to get away from that?
I've debated this a lot because I feel like for my whole life I've tried to avoid labels and felt like they weren't useful. Mm-hmm. But the older I get, the more I find that they can be useful so that you feel like part of a community. It took a very long time before I was able to identify as being queer because I didn't feel like I needed to put a label on that. And then the first time I ever got to say it, it actually felt kind of like a relief, like, oh, I know that I belong somewhere. And so I think that there's a comfort factor from that for people to realize, like, I'm not alone or I'm not weird. Like, there are other people out there like me. And so having someone that you can relate to in these positions is really helpful with those labels.
Well, and then that gets into representation matters. And then we're thinking about representation in space, whether it is going to space or in the space industry, and how that representation has changed over time. So thinking about the present, from your perspective, what is the current landscape like for women in space exploration? And in particular, I'd love for us to talk about Launch America. We were just talking about Artemis, but also the upcoming NASA astronaut selection, or anything having to do with space currently. Uli, what about you? What do you think about?
Yeah, so I think the landscape is better than ever. Kind of what we were speaking to in the beginning, looking back from where we came from to now, just seeing this shift and more involvement. And I also wanted to speak to a point you mentioned about the diversity, because Project Possum, which I'm also a part of, is doing huge strides in this to be inclusive of so many different people from so many different backgrounds, as well as countries around the world. Space should be for everyone. We should all be able to access it. And whether it's going up into space or whether it's working in the space sector, I think there's a lot more also opportunities, not only in government, but private. And so just seeing a lot more women engineers, scientists, women wanting to be astronauts, we're seeing so much more interest. I'd be really curious to see the split for the newest NASA astronaut application. I know it's like 12,000, but how many of those are women? Just to see how that evolution is. I don't know the answer, maybe you do, but yeah, I'd be very curious to see that. And I think that we definitely are progressing in the right direction.
It was not the 2017 class, it was 2013 was the one before that it was 50-50 in the selection process. 50-50. There was only 8 taken, but half of them were female. So the question is, will this be the first time in the NASA selection history where women outnumber men? Would that be something to see? But we just had Launch America too. Tanya, do you have anything to say about this, what we're talking about?
I feel like it was definitely disappointing to a lot of people to see that the return to flight was comprised of 2 white men. And it was like glaringly obvious when they got onto the space station. And then you have an entire space station crew of white men. And it felt like nothing had really changed. And I know that NASA's been trying to promote, well, look at the crew that we have for the real launch, the one that is no longer a demo. And that's great. But again, even though it's not the demo, that's not the first to the people that have been watching this. This crew demo was the first. And the folks that are going to launch on the Boeing Starliner, yeah, that's the first for Boeing, but it was not the return to flight. And so I think it will feel less impactful in the end, unfortunately.
You know, it was so noticeable, and that message again, and it really gets to what we were talking about earlier, who gets to be first? And to some extent, what does that say if the history of first has always been white male, and we just had a Launch America, and again, all we saw was a white male. And one of the things for me that really stood out is if you looked at the poster of who is for SpaceX and who is for Boeing Starliner, I think there's 9 people and only 2 of them are women for the Boeing. And again, the criteria for selection of being a test pilot and a military aviator. And so the history of lag of women having access to that obviously leads to a ripple effect in the lag of access to be selected and first. Uli, as someone who has applied for the astronaut program, was a semifinalist, and now going into this next selection process, when we think about access and first and the selection criteria, are there things that you'd like to see change? How has it changed from 2017 to 2020? Number one, because there were changes that were made. And are there any things that you would like to see moving forward when it comes to who do we look at for space?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point also that Tanya raises. There is this dichotomy from what is being said is being done as far as the selection in the past with NASA and how many more women there are in the astronaut corps, but then what we see with Demo 2 and all white male. And one can argue with the government too. You know, we had so many choices and we're again in that in white male. So definitely want to be seeing changes. Like I said, I've seen progress, but there's still a lot more that needs to happen. So the selection process this year is a little more involved. I think it was tied to probably so many applicants in the 2017 class. So now you have to have a master's degree, for example. And so I'm very curious as to how the interview process will go. I remember from my own personal experience, you know, it was challenging. They were asking so many interesting questions that I hadn't ever thought in detail about from leadership and followership. So thinking about women and what roles that we play in both of those, you know, historically probably more following than leading, right? And then also I'm thinking about from the perspective of women in space, you know, one point I want to make is, you know, usually we're smaller. And so it'll cost less to send us into space, right?
So true. I want to welcome our other panelists, Dr. Shauna Pandya. Yay! Welcome. How are you doing today?
Hi, you guys. Thank you. Yeah, I'm great. Sorry for being late, but I'm glad that I made it in. And you saw me nodding emphatically with the last thing Uli said, because I agree. We need more women in space.
We were just talking about kind of the present landscape and Launch America. And I know that you're in Canada. And so was there any kind of, from an international perspective, how did that, watching that launch, how did that make you feel? And is that a symbol for anything for the future of women internationally. What do you think?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, first of all, thanks for the question. Second of all, hey Uli, hey Tanya, great to see you guys. Yeah, as a Canadian, I was thrilled. It's not a point of American pride. Absolutely it is, but it's a point of human pride. Someone online had asked me, how I felt about that, and that was exactly my response. And that any time you make space more accessible to all of humanity, it's an incredibly powerful thing. And I think that going forward, our job is to make space more accessible to everyone. That includes women. I'm sure it's been brought up already that the current landscape of gender breakdown for access to space is 12% for females. So we absolutely need to do better. And commercial space is simply another way to get there. And the question that I like to ask, and I had an entire TED Talk on this, is what if we make space more accessible to everyone? What if we give access to professions that never previously had access to space, like artists and entrepreneurs and athletes? What will come when we give people access to that platform? So, Launch America was thrilling to watch. I had chills. It was a generational moment, and it was a point of pride. It's not just an American thing, but it's a human thing.
So, picking up on that, and to the rest of the panelists, what does commercial space bring potentially in the form of access from international, for women, for any group? What are some of the things that you'd like to see happen as the international landscape opens up? I mean, not the international, the commercial space landscape opens up.
I think it's going to start changing our perspective on what it means to be an astronaut. There was a Pew Research study not too long ago that interviewed a bunch of adults across America asking if they wanted to go into space, if they wanted to be space tourists. And a lot of people said no because of cost, or they were worried about danger, or they just didn't think that they were capable of being an astronaut. But when you think about things like Virgin Galactic was planning on launching Stephen Hawking, for example, into space, the stuff that we think about to be the right stuff for an astronaut isn't necessarily what you need to go into space if you're not going to be working on the space station for NASA. And so I think once we start seeing some of these tourism flights, yes, initially they're going to be incredibly biased toward extremely wealthy people, and it will probably be that way for a long time. But I think as that starts changing our perspectives on, regular people can go to space physically, then maybe it will change a little bit of the perspective on space in general. It will feel like something that is more accessible and approachable to everybody.
Uli, do you have anything to add?
I'm gonna go back to Mount Everest again. But just seeing, for example, like for the first teams that were going up Everest, and it was saved for the elite people, the elite athletes who had the funding, the means, and the athletic ability to do it. And then you look at the landscape of Everest now, so more people are able to climb the mountain. And so I think it has opened up just when you think about nature, for example, our planet, the environment, it changes perspectives. Like it personally has for me when climbing mountains, and for many people too. I mean, some people obviously are wanting to go just for the sake of going, but then I think it can absolutely change attitudes. So thinking about it from the space perspective, making it accessible for more people, being able to see our planet from space could really serve us well when we're tackling big problems on this planet, when it comes to being able to include people, in this new frontier, as well as saving our planet from the threat of climate change. So I absolutely believe that we should be able to have access. The deterrent right now is money, right? Like Everest still costs, $60,000 to $100,000. That's way out of my reach. How am I going to do it? I have the dream. Space is millions, right? Or hundreds of thousands. So I think it'll move in a direction where hopefully it'll become more affordable, because at this point, you're still not including everyone who can't or who doesn't have the financial means. But I think it's absolutely imperative for our species to be able to have that life-changing perspective. I mean, all the astronauts say that when they go up there.
when we think about this and change and access, well, a lot of that starts by looking at industry and who's the leaders, and making sure that you have diverse leadership at the top in order so that they can also promote diverse leadership thinking throughout the ranks. And so how you're all leaders in what you do, and as women of color, how has that climb to the top been as you're working your way through industry or starting your own company or in medicine, and that how are you navigating your way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sian. So I think, for me personally, having had the luxury of lived and worked and been in so many different industries, whether you're talking about medicine, aviation, aerospace, space, martial arts, skydiving, you have the luxury of seeing what good teams, what diverse teams, what the most functional teams are like. And then also what the unfortunate worst aspect of it is like, and what it's like to be singled out because you may not be like or look like everyone else. But there is a way to take those even the less positive experiences and turn it into something that's productive. And for me, I would say the most productive and powerful and positive experiences have been in the space world, where you're simply a high functioning teammate with the same objective as everyone else, to the less positive experiences in medicine. And the way that's translated productively for me going forward is just saying that this will not happen on my watch. If you are on my team, if you are a member of my team, if you are a junior, if you are my equal, if I see you in a position of being discriminated against, or experiencing hardship simply because of your demographic or who you are, it will not happen. And I think the lesson for me is that this is, the culture that we accept professionally and even in our everyday lives is a reflection of ourselves. So it's not simply enough to disapprove of these things. It's not simply enough to disagree with them. We have to take active steps to make sure that we pave the way to allow more perspectives and engineer these environments so that everyone's able to perform at their best.
Very good point that you bring up. A lot of good points, actually. Tanya or Uli, do you have anything to add to this?
She said that brilliantly. I mean, that was beautifully stated. And also, like, just as a woman in science, in space, and in mountaineering, I've always encountered that you have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition still, right? And so I think, like, hopefully, like, all of us can serve as role models in the possibilities, the things that we've encountered. Our stories are important to tell and share as well. I think it's very important for us to be serving in mentorship roles as much as possible. And really, like I said, your silence is telling on you, right? So really speaking up and also taking that decisive action is critical.
Speaking of that, obviously we're coming in the United States with Black Lives Matters, Black in STEM, Black in Nature, and the Black in the Ivory. And so there's been a lot of chatter about representation, but how you're treated or having to work twice as hard as others to prove that you belong in this institution or in this group. And so for me, when you're talking about speaking up and being on Twitter and finding my voice, and it was really interesting because a good friend of mine and Tanya's, John Conifay, he had a special panel that I helped, I guess, moderate. I'm like, what is the word I'm doing right now? I'm moderating. And there was somebody, I was 50, the oldest, and then the youngest person, Toya, was, I think she's 22. And it was really interesting because very vocal on Twitter, and me not so much. And she made a comment about, how disappointed she was that her role models hadn't been more vocal. The older people of color weren't as vocal. And to me, I feel like I'm kind of in that category, but I've been trained to not step out of line to some extent as a woman of color, as somebody trying to be successful. And so how have you been able to find your voice and empower your voice? What ways are you doing exactly what Shauna has said and just trying to make that difference? Can you give some examples from ways of doing this?
I've been quite vocal on Twitter and some of the talks that I've given at conferences, like at Said Space Vision last year, about the challenges that I faced in terms of harassment in the field, to the point where I literally applied for a job at Starbucks because I was being treated so horribly in my job as a scientist that I didn't think I dreamed of this my whole life, and I was like, this isn't worth it. I'm just going to leave. And then I didn't get the job at Starbucks. They don't want people with a master's degree in geology. And my goal with that is to try and help people realize, like, if it's happening to you, it's not just you. It's not okay. There are ways that you can stand up for yourself. Unfortunately, the system is not built in a way to be supportive of you. Like, I've never found human resources at a company or a university to be helpful in these matters whatsoever. So you have to be empowered to take the action yourself and stand up and say, this is not okay. And that can be terrifying, especially if you're a person that doesn't have that type of personality to speak out. And I certainly was not that kind of person until it came to the point where I had been harassed and the response from HR was, maybe you would be happier if you worked somewhere else. Not to deal with the person that was doing the harassing, but to say it would be easier if you left. And my whole life changed in that moment. And I said, no, I worked really hard to get here, and I'm not going to leave because someone else can't control their behavior. And kind of like Shauna said, the horrible things that happen to you in your career can become, I hate to say beneficial, but they play into your personality and how you deal with everything after that. And from then on, I was like, I can't stand by and watch people be harassed or be taken advantage of or not speak up for themselves. And so I try to encourage everybody to do that in real life when I run into grad students who are being taken advantage of, on Twitter, when I see people talking about stories like this. I try to point them in the direction of resources that they can turn to when they feel like they've tried the official channels and nothing's happened.
Oh, wow. I will say that I was at Space Vision when you gave that talk, and it was amazing. And I can't say how much you could feel the atmosphere in the room change as, you know, the story and your experience and being able to relate to that in my own career. And again, empowering women or people who haven't had access with a voice and a way to share our stories. I loved how you said that, because it means that we're not alone. And that was one of the things that I realized on Twitter when I was reading all of these other Black in the Ivory hashtags. And I was like, I'm not alone. And then I was like, oh, well, then I will share my story. But it still scared me because I went to school 15 minutes down the road. And I just did my sabbatical there. And I was like, oh, people are going to know, you know, but if I don't say something, how are things going to get better? And so, Uli or Shauna, do you have an example that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I have Uli, you look like you have something to say, and then I can go after. Oh, yeah, so I'm just there's so many emotions here. There's outrage, there's anger, there's there's fear of what happens if you speak up, and there's this this discussion is so this could be a panel unto itself. And so the one thing I do want to say is having peers and starting to talk about it is so important. And some of us even here have had discussions offline. Sian, I've been following your hashtag Black in the Ivory, and even that this happens to the best, and that it's the fact that it's justice in of itself is not, because that we're not having our story told.
Shauna, I don't know, is anybody else having difficulty hearing her? Yeah, you broke up there right when you were getting to the good stuff. And so I'm going to ask you to, we got to following the hashtag Black in the Ivory, and then you started to break up. Could you repeat what you were saying?
Yeah, so with the hashtag Black in the Ivory, the fact, so are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Perfect. The fact that we're still shocked by these things, when I read your stories, I was outraged for you. I was sad. I was shocked. And the fact that we're still shocked when we hear these stories from our colleagues means we need to do a better job of sharing these stories. Whether we're minorities, whether we're female, every single one of us has a story to tell. And, Tanya, part of me, when you shared your story, was angry and said, who said that to you? I just want to talk. But then part of me reflected on that, like, yeah, I have stories like that. So starting to talk about this is really important, because when we go to people in positions of power, and when they shrug off our experiences, they're not doing their job. And that means they don't belong in their job. And so part of this is generational, and I suspect that's why, those of us who are, mid 30s and above, that's why we want to, maybe we've tried to speak up and it wasn't taken seriously. Maybe there was fear of being sidelined in terms of advancement. Both of those have applied to me, and Sian, you said it has applied to you as well. And so I think we need to encourage everyone to speak up without fear of retribution, but also we need to have that generational change, that if you are in a position of power and you are not listening to those who are bringing documented experiences to you, then you're not doing your job, and you need to step aside. And for me personally, I'm specifically referring to two instances of two different program directors in surgical training where, I brought documented examples of racism, documented examples of discrimination. And, like Tanya's experience, the easier thing was to not stir the pot, was not to confront a friend or a colleague, was not to talk about the problematic ones. And that in and of itself is a problem. And like I said, for me, that has to translate into, this won't happen on my watch, because it did happen to me.
And like touching on that just really quickly, so last year at the Women in Space conference, we had everybody raise their hands in the audience. Are you an undergrad, a grad student, postdoc, faculty, industry, to get an idea of who was there. And by the time we got to any senior level things like professors, we basically had two people in the entire audience. And I posed the question to the audience of, I want us to all think about why this is the case. Why are there no senior women here? Is it because they don't think these conversations are important to have? Is it because they're too busy and so they can't come? They're just overloaded with things. But I felt like it was quite telling, the fact that so many young women felt like we needed to have these conversations about harassment and inclusion, and the I don't want to say older generation, I don't mean that in a bad way, but the women that were more senior were not able to have a voice.
And I want to there's so many things here, but there's talking about senior people and voice. We have a comment from Allison about the fact that a lot of older people, Black polar scientists, they're not on social media. And one of the things that I know, so how do they become connected to some extent? And this whole idea of community and why community is important, because when I had that conversation with Toya, she said, I asked her, I said, are you and your peers talking about this? She said, all the time. And growing up, but I didn't have anybody to talk to about it with. I was the only Black female, or, there were other females, but we were not, we were told this is something that you don't discuss. And so how do we, people who need to be brought into the conversation, how do we bring them in? So what I want to do is I want to go to Uli, because I know you were going to say something. And then I want to go back to Tanya about the Women in Space conference. And so, Uli, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I was agreeing with everything that's been said, but also this world and this society makes it so hard to be vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that definitely is changing, especially in social media. And like what Allison wrote here, we have to embrace the necessary evil to use for good and raising voices, right? With all the hashtags, I think it's so important, like seeing these hashtags and conversations happening, people being vulnerable is a huge step. This has to continue. But how do we bring these people into the fold too with community. I mean, there's blogs, for example, we could start specifically on these topics. It's still online, but I think having actual physical community, right? Like I teach, and I've told my students, my door is open. If you need help beyond classroom stuff that we're talking about, if you have any concerns about the class, and I've had a whole plethora of students in my class, Native American, African American, Latino. They would come to me.
Uli, you're breaking up now a little bit too. Unfortunately, the challenges of technology.
Oh no. Can you hear me now?
I can. Yes, we can hear you now.
Where did it break?
Well, pretty much in the middle when you're getting good about your class and access and being available. Yeah, so I was just taking the point that like we have all the online resources, at our disposal, but we also need to be physically present for each other, face to face, when we obviously can do it again safely post-pandemic. Having an open door, it's a safe space to talk about this, because I've had Native American, African American, and Latinos in my class who have come and used that open door policy to chat about me. I'm dealing with this discrimination. I'm having challenges. Can you help? Can you be an ally and an advocate? Absolutely. And so as leaders, and Tanya, I want to get to, you're talking about having that open door and access, being a role model, all of these things. It puts a lot of responsibility on us to make these changes that we want to see. You started the Women in Space conference. Tell us why. And I was kind of surprised that there wasn't a Women in Space conference before you started it. So
yeah. So my co-founder, it looks like Sarah Missouri, is also dialed in. I saw her in the comments. So we were also surprised that this didn't exist. And we actually started it the first year at the University of Toronto, expecting it to be this like small, very Canadian thing. And somehow it garnered a bunch of traction on Twitter. And I would say at the end, most of the people that came were not from Canada. And the response was, we need to do this again. And we had decided to take a focus that the science that you do is not separate from who you are as a person. And usually the discussions that you have about the non-science side of things end up getting shoved into these lunchtime discussions or happy hours. You don't have a panel about harassment in STEM in the middle of the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference, for example. So we wanted to have those things in the middle of the program, highlighting the work that women are doing in space, but also all of the challenges that we're dealing with that are impeding our work and our ability to advance our careers in this field. And this actually ties on really perfectly to what you were saying. We had to cancel the conference this year because of COVID, and we made the very conscious decision to not just shift it to being an online conference because of that human contact aspect. The fact that you had 100+ women all in a room together where they could talk and confide in each other, that created so many connections that I don't think you can get in a virtual space. And we felt like these conversations meant enough that we needed to keep this something in person. We have added these new monthly seminar sessions to kind of keep the community going until we can hold the conference again next May. So stay tuned for that. But they're the last Thursday of every month. So to at least give us some way to stay connected with each other. But yeah, I think these are really important discussions for us to have so that we can try to move forward as a community and figure out, okay, we know what the problems are. How do we actually take action to address these things and move forward?
Yeah, that's so true. Does anybody else have anything to add?
I'll add that Shauna over here is hopefully still one of our keynotes next year if we can make the dates work out. And you too, Sian. So I got to just come into a little bit of the one that you had in Tempe. And again, it's finding community where you can feel empowered to raise your voice and when you go back home. And then when you go back home, you still have that community to support you in different ways. When you think about your career and where you are now, where do you want to go for the future? We talked about the past, we're talking about the present, but what about the future for yourselves? Where do you see yourselves going in 5 or 10 years? Where would you like to be?
I think we're all grinning here because I think we're secretly thinking space.
I'll be to the space station with all of you. That'd be great. Like, just send us
that
up.
would be That would be amazing. And I suspect I may have a similar answer to Tanya and Uli, but definitely space. With great teams pushing the boundaries, continue to explore here on Earth. There's so much here on Earth that we want to explore. Ocean exploration. We've only mapped 5% of the surfaces. And prior to 2 weeks ago, no woman had been to the Marianas Trench. And now, since then, we've had 2 women go there. Dr. Kathy Sullivan was the first female to walk in space and the first female to walk on the ocean floor. So for me personally, helping push the boundaries of exploration, and I can tell from the expressions that Uli and Tanya agree as well. And then for me personally, also having a lasting legacy to human exploration in terms of space medicine. So if I can make a lasting contribution to how we keep humans in space healthy on long duration space flight, to contributing to the buildup of space medicine on the moon, building the first OR suite on the moon. Those would be really, really cool and worthwhile for me to contribute to in my life.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And, we read your bio earlier, and with the noticeable of space and sex. And that was something that is, when we think about that, and what does that mean if we're going to make a permanent settlement on the moon and Mars? What will that mean for humanity? And medically, there's a whole lot there. Uli, what about you?
Yeah,
I definitely agree. Yeah, space, but I also want to be seeing more diversity, inclusivity. I want us to be coming together as a species to problem solve. We have the issue as we see. I'm in climate change mode right now, since I'm teaching a course on it, and we have students wondering, what's happening by 2030, 2050, what's our future like? So I really want to see these problems of climate change and going to the moon, Mars, and beyond, that we come together as a species, putting together the best minds and solving these. And it goes back to what you said in my class, Sian. Actually, it's like, what problem do you want to solve? Was the advice she gave to students. Absolutely. There's so many problems to be solved. There's also so many adventures to be had, exploration that still needs to happen. Maybe like in 2020, we think, what else is there to explore, right? Like, well, I sometimes feel I'm living in the wrong time, the wrong era. I missed the boat, if you will. But now, we're on the shores of this cosmic ocean. Now there's so much out there yet to be explored.
And what about you, Tanya?
I probably won't go into space that quickly, just because, like I've said a few times in interviews, I'm actually super claustrophobic, so I hate getting in airplanes. So it might take a little while before I go to space. I remember telling someone at Planet, one of our VPs, very early on, we had a conversation when I started working there, and they asked me what my goal was. And I said, I want to become your chief scientist. And he just kind of smiled at me. It's not a role that exists, but I've done a really great job in my career of making the jobs that I wanted to exist. The job I have at Planet right now did not exist until I came in and I made up my own job title. So there are a lot of things out there that you can just make happen for yourself if you try really, really hard. So I think wanting to do something where you're a woman in the C-suite of a company, which is still not very common right now, especially in the space industry, is something where you can start to affect change, because we really need, like you said, more women in leadership positions so that we can influence how things are going through the entire company. Although I should say, I do admire how good of a job Planet does in that regard. We have a really diverse population of employees. It definitely tapers off as you get toward the higher ups, like most aerospace companies do, just from experience and things like that. But I feel like of everywhere that I've worked, they've done a really amazing job, and the women that are in leadership positions there are fantastic, and I admire so many of them.
And that's basically what we need is we rise in the ranks of these leadership positions, and the people who are there now is supporting all of the initiatives that are happening. And so when we think about, I like to say solving for space solves for Earth, because there is no better place than planet Earth. And when we think about what's happening on Earth with climate change and some of the grand challenges that we have here, what do you say to people who are like, well, space, everything here, well, how can you even think about that when in the cities we have people marching and protesting and all of these things? And there was this real dichotomy between Launch America and Black Lives Matter. And so how did that resonate with you, seeing these two things? Because me as an African-American female, I was really torn by it because on the one hand, I'm like, oh my goodness, I should be, marching in the streets. But on the other hand, I was in my spacesuit right there. What side am I pointing to? And I'm dancing up and down saying, yeah, we're going back to space. What kind of emotions have you been feeling?
Oh my gosh, what a complicated question. I'm laughing because I'm feeling so many mixed emotions, Sian. Like you, in fact, there's a noticeable lack of activity on my social media for the past 2 weeks. And it's not because I haven't been busy. I'm doing at least an interview and a podcast, plus clinic, plus space, plus medicine, plus space medicine stuff daily. It's not that I'm less busy. It's just that none of it seems to matter to post about in the context of what's going on right now. I'm having tough conversations privately behind the scenes on the amount of racism that exists in everyday life. There's in Canada, as was correctly alluded to earlier, this podcast is the amount of systemic discrimination that occurs with the Indigenous population. And it's, I alluded to my own experiences with racism in medicine, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, it's layers upon layers of racism. And it's, I've spent a lot of time soul searching these past 2 weeks because, there's so many emotions. There's the sorrow that exists that human beings have to go through this. There's the shock when there shouldn't be shock that we're still learning about, how African Americans, African Canadians are being profiled, how Indigenous people experience their interactions with the government, with the RCMP. So there is that sorrow, and you're right, Sian. It's so conflicting to be experiencing joy at the best of what humanity can do and celebrating Astro Doug and Astro Bob going into space, but realizing we have a lot of problems to solve in the meantime. And for me, what I've been doing is I've been collecting my thoughts, and I'm about 2,000 words in right now, on my daily personal introspection of, what my experiences and what my processing of racism is. But like we alluded to earlier, any obstacle, any challenge is an opportunity to do things better. And for me, I think this means coming up with concrete ways of how to make things better, how to have those discussions. And, it comes down to acknowledging our privilege, acknowledging our power, acknowledging our platforms and what we use them for, and finally practicing compassion, patience, and forgiveness. And that's for the past and for mistakes we've made as a society. It's forgiveness for others and believing the best of people and realizing that we all have the ability to evolve. And then also forgiveness and compassion for ourselves, because none of us are perfect. And I think if we all aim to do a little bit better every single day, that's a productive path forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much loved everything you said. Uli, do you have anything to add?
That was beautifully stated, and I've also been thinking about it a lot because beyond the climate change class that I'm teaching, we're also talking about these kinds of injustices, environmental racism. We're speaking about the Black Lives Matters movement, as well as Indigenous people in, for example, the Amazon rainforest area. What's happening there? What's happening with minority groups globally? They're suffering the most from climate change that they had nothing to do with. So we've definitely been integrating, the social science with the physical science behind this. And they're hard conversations to have, virtually quite challenging to do because we use Slack to send messages and prompts. But, at least we're having the conversations. We are actually trying to figure out what can we do. I'm coming from a place of privilege. How can I use my voice? What actions can I be taking? And, and then my husband, he's Mexican. And so he's shared his own stories of discrimination against him, which I didn't realize, you know, the extent of this and how pervasive it is in our country. And you know what? It's enough. It's enough. You know, it's time. This is a global movement, you know, and we are all citizens of this planet. You know, we all have the right to be here, and rights, the human rights, you know, that are being infringed upon. That's enough. So absolutely, like, encouraged by this, but also hoping, cautiously optimistic that this does lead to actual change, right? It's good for us to be speaking up, but let's do something also, the action.
You know, and that's the thing about action, and we're on Starship Earth, and so if we can build a starship that we try to get people to get along with on the International Space Station, can we do it here? Tanya, do you have anything to add?
I think people tend to find stuff like Launch America a distraction in the middle of these definitely more important discussions that are going on right now. But I think we also have to remember that nothing exists in a bubble. And even if we stopped going to space today, we would still have all these problems that we have on Earth. We're not doing a great job at focusing on fixing them. So on the one hand, yes, we have much more important things that we need to be dealing with. And this is the first time I've ever felt hopeful that things might change, just with the level of conversation that's going on, the duration of conversation, and the protests and everything that's happening. It gives me more hope than I've ever had before that we might actually get some real change to make our society better out of this. I hope that maybe things like space give us something to look forward to. Like, this is the future that we could have. Look towards something like Star Trek. We can all live together peacefully and work together for the benefit of all of humanity. And it's something that is possible. We've dreamed about this. It's something we can achieve, but we have to put in the work now to be able to get to that point later.
And, you know, I think one of the valuable things that has been mentioned is the fact that, you know, space is so heavy on science, but that's social science and the conversations that need to be brought together, that they're not independent from each other. And if we can bring both of these together and have the hard conversations and the science together, then we can maybe make some progress in ways that we, you know, towards that Star Trek world that we all want to live in. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to leave with, first of all, thanking everybody who has come and left comments and just joined us today, and the panelists. Could you each just take a moment to tell our audience how they can connect or follow you, and a quote that you would like to share, whether it's one of your own or one out there that you just love? Uli, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram, and so that's at Science in the Wild, and that's my company. And then one of my favorite quotes when it comes to space is, "Don't tell me the sky's the limit," when there are footprints on the moon.
I love that. Very cool. Shauna?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, Sian, thank you so much for organizing this, and awesome to be on this panel, because Uli, Tanya, I respect you, and Sian, I respect you all immensely. So this was fun. To find me on social media at Shauna Pandya, ShawnAPandya. That's Instagram and Twitter. Dr. Shauna Pandya on Facebook, and Shauna Pandya MD on LinkedIn. My favorite quote is just kind of a motto I've come to embrace, is set a goal, work really, really, really hard to get there, and then actually keep along here, because you do.
Oh, love that. And Tanya?
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Medium, pretty much anywhere as at Tanya of Mars. And I didn't think to find a quote, but I think the one that inspired me the most has been from Star Trek my whole life: to boldly go where no one has gone before.
Oh, I love it, love it, love it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I feel so thankful that I could bring these three amazing women together to share your stories and to celebrate the first female in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and the future of what it just looks good. We've got challenges, but with all of us working together, I feel optimistic that we can take these on. And that includes all of you out there who have been listening today. For me, it's all about space to inspire. And so a lot of times when I talk about space, people think outer space, I mean actually this space, the space around you within one arm's length of you is the most amazing space imaginable because it encompasses you and everything that you do, think, breathe, interact with, all of that. And you carry it with you everywhere you go and in everything you do. And so use your space to inspire those within your reach and beyond. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And have an awesome Valentina's Day. Bye.